On November 9, 2004, 39-year-old best-selling historian Iris Chang committed suicide. She left 3 separate suicide notes, each different from the other, but none spelling out exactly why she was taking her own life. One of the notes included broad swipes at the CIA and other unnamed organizations that she claimed were persecuting her for some reason. People who knew her believed those ideas to have been side effects of the powerful medicines she was taking after a severe bout of depression combined with bipolar disorder. Those same people also think that her suicide was brought on by the stress of her busy life, and probably most of all by the subjects of her books, specifically one book, The Rape of Nanking, which was published in 1997. Chang's first book, Thread of the Silkworm 1996, was about a Chinese scientist who had been accused of being a communist spy while she worked on the famous Manhattan Project to build the atomic bomb in World War II. This man was eventually deported back to China in the early 1950s, despite most of his American colleagues vouching for his anti-communism. Her third book was The Chinese in America, A Narrative History, 2003, which among other things detailed the extreme prejudice encountered by both Chinese immigrants and those born in America. At the time of her death, Chang was working on her fourth book, this one about the horrific slaughter of American and Filipino troops during the infamous Bataan Death March in 1942. All of Miss Chang's works delved into some of the very darkest places of the human soul, but it was her second book, The Rape of Nanking, that brought her both notoriety and exposure to some of the most nightmarish things that human beings can do to each other. Her many interviews with survivors of the Nanking atrocity haunted. What you are about to hear and see may shock you. Therefore, we recommend this video for adults or older teens with adult supervision. We do not say this lightly. We also hope that if you learned something valuable from watching today, please like and subscribe so we can continue bringing you important historical content. Before we continue, we know that today the city of Nanking is referred to and known throughout the world as Nanjing. But what happened in the central Chinese city made such an indelible mark on both history and the psyches of many people of the time and since that it has always been known, at least in the English-speaking world, as the Rape of Nanking, and that is how we'll refer to it as well. From 1603 to 1854, Japan was a closed country. No one could leave the country, and foreigners were limited to a small port near Hiroshima. So when the American naval officer Matthew C. Perry forced Japan to open to trade and diplomacy with the outside world, the country was 200 years behind the rest of the world economically, technologically, and militarily. Over the next 40 to 50 years, however, Japan transformed itself from a feudal society governed by an outdated warrior class to a regional power. In 1896, the Japanese defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War over influence in Korea. Japan also won the island of Taiwan and several other concessions in Chinese cities, which essentially put the Japanese in control of small parts of China. However, Japan was not alone in this. By 1900, China was a weak, corrupt, and divided power, and along with the English, French, Germans, Russians, and Americans, all had areas of China that were, if not under their direct control, were heavily influenced by them. In 1904 to 1905, Japan won a stunning victory over the Russian Empire. This war, too, was over influence in Korea, which also bordered Russia. With this victory, Japan gained control of Korea and took over Russian interests in northern China. In the 1920s and 30s, many internal and external factors led to the Japanese military's increased power over its civilian government. Moreover, by the second half of the 1930s, the Japanese military government had established almost total control over the government, the economy, and Japanese society. Added to that was the idea that the Japanese culture and people were superior to all others, especially to China and the Chinese, with which Japan had a love-hate relationship for centuries. In 1931, the Japanese army provoked an incident in Manchuria, today a part of China, but then a sort of an autonomous territory governed by Chinese military warlords. This was what we now call a false flag operation, which ostensibly gave the Japanese an excuse to invade and take over resource-rich Manchuria. In 1937, the Japanese again provoked an incident with the Chinese, except that this one led to the full-scale invasion of China itself. Within a short time, the Japanese drove south along the Chinese coast, capturing important cities and establishing control of a large part of coastal China and its hundreds of millions of inhabitants. From August to October 1937, stiffening Chinese resistance in the vital port city of Shanghai resulted in a battle sometimes referred to by historians as Stalingrad on the Yangtze River. The Japanese won the battle, but the stubborn resistance of the Chinese and a high number of Japanese casualties contributed to the Japanese hatred for China and its people. The next Japanese target was Nanking, then the capital of China. As you listen to what we're about to tell you, remember that in 1937, China, outside of the main cities, and even within them to a large degree, was governed by a notoriously corrupt, fractured, and inefficient government, nominally ruled over by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. Though Chiang's Kuomintang or nationalist government controlled most of the cities in China, especially in the west, much of the rest of the country was ruled either by the communists under Mao Zedong or an assortment of warlords, who ran large parts of the country as their personal empire. We say this because there has been much debate in China, Japan, and the rest of the world about the number of people in Nanking before the Japanese arrived, and the number that remained after the atrocities that were about to begin ceased. Census taking in China was almost non-existent then, and many reports about population were wrong because people avoided being counted. That could be used for tax and other purposes. Files that did exist were irregularly kept and updated. Additionally, many people who lived in Nanking before the war fled as the Japanese approached, and others, refugees fleeing the enemy, moved into the city for safety. A large number of Chinese soldiers retreating from the Japanese advance to set up the city's defense also increased the population of Nanking. Estimates of the population of Nanking before the Japanese arrived range from about 200,000 to 500,000 or more. The publicly stated Japanese policy in China was called the burn to ash policy, or the more well-known 3 alls policy. The 3 alls were kill all, burn all, loot all. Again, this was the openly stated name of the Japanese policy in China. The battle for the city and the surrounding area began on December 1, 1937. When Japanese troops arrived in the capital on December 13, 1937, they immediately engaged the exhausted remnants of the Chinese forces within the city and drove most of them out within a day or two. The Chinese army was tired, demoralized, and afraid, and in their haste to flee the Japanese, some Chinese units fired on each other to clear the roads and get ahead of the others to get away, for it was known by almost every Chinese soldier that falling alive into Japanese hands was a fate worse than death. The Japanese almost immediately began a spree of killing, torture, and rape that went on for 6 weeks. Among the many atrocities were Japanese officers who challenged each other to see who could behead the most Chinese in a certain amount of time with their samurai swords. Chinese soldiers and civilians, including the elderly, infirm, women, and children, were corralled into different areas of the city, and under the eye of machine gunners who cut down anyone trying to flee, began to lop the heads off of their victims. Enlisted Japanese soldiers then stacked them into grisly piles which were left to rot. Other soldiers and officers used their bayonets, spearing as many Chinese as possible. Making things worse, if that's possible, was the fact that the Japanese drank themselves stupid before, during, and after these incidents. Many times, locals in different areas of the city knew that the best time to try to escape was by judging how drunk the Japanese were, for many of them passed out for a time in the evening, only to wake up the next day and begin again. The uses the Japanese found for their long bayonets defy imagination. We are telling you this because it happened and should not be forgotten. Some of the victims of Japanese bayonets were pregnant women. Some were babies tossed in the air and caught on the weapon. Even more grisly contests were held involving enlisted men, since only officers could carry swords. Another episode of torture involved about 200 men, women, and children and took place inside a school. This torture involved using long needles with handles, not ice picks and not medical needles, somewhere in between, that were inserted into eyes, mouths, navels, and genitals. Chinese civilians were crucified on trees, phone poles, and walls. People had their eyes gouged out and noses cut off, before having gasoline poured over them and set afire. Thousands more were thrown into ditches filled with kerosene and gas and set alight. Tanks and truck drivers also had contests, seeing how many Chinese they could run over at once. Japanese soldiers bound groups of Chinese together along a bridge on the Yangtze River and pushed them into the river below. It went on and on and on and on for 6 weeks. Iris Chang was criticized, not her accounts of the atrocities, many of which were known, especially within China. The Japanese acted with great brutality on many occasions throughout the war, everywhere they went. No, the criticism of Miss Chang's book was that she was thought to have overestimated the number of dead, which did not include those tortured or who survived their sexual assault. Chang's estimate ran towards 1 million. Most people believe this is too high, but the consensus is that 100,000 and 250,000 people were killed. The only people who denied the entirety of Chang's book were and are extreme Japanese nationalists, who in their delusion portray the Japanese as a victim of the West and the Chinese. We call the atrocity that occurred at Nanking what we call it because that is precisely what happened. Tens of thousands of Chinese women and girls were raped. Some of the victims were 70 years old and even older. Some were as young as 6 and 7. Pregnant women were assaulted. Many of those who weren't murdered miscarried. Many of the women who survived became pregnant. Many killed themselves rather than give birth to the child of the man who assaulted them. Some of these assaults were carried out by individual soldiers, others by groups of them. Some women and girls were raped repeatedly. Other victims were killed immediately after and even during their assault. So you now know why we warned you at the beginning of this video. Much about the Nanking Massacre is hard to believe because it was so absolutely horrific. Fortunately for some of those in Nanking, another hard-to-believe story saved their lives. John Rabe, a German trade official and Nazi Party member, remained in the city to help other Europeans remain safe from the Battle of Nanking and the atrocities afterward. At the time, Germany and Japan were not allies. As a matter of fact, the Germans had sold supplies to the Chinese military for years, but relations between the countries were getting closer in 1937 and would lead to an alliance in 1940. The Japanese did not want to alienate Hitler by violating German property during their invasion. Within a short time, Rabe and his staff were admitting Chinese citizens into his diplomatic safe zone. What's more, they were venturing into the city and issuing diplomatic safe conduct passes to anyone they could find. Rabe is credited with saving thousands, if not tens of thousands of people. After the war, Rabe was arrested by the British as a high Nazi Party member and a possible war criminal. His family fell on hard times even after his release. The people and government of Nanjing sent food parcels and other supplies to his family until the Chinese Civil War began in 1949. Rabe's gravestone was moved from Germany to Nanking, where it stands today outside the museum dedicated to telling the story of the rape of Nanking. In a prominent place, another statue stands near the one dedicated to the massacre's victims, that of a young Chinese-American writer who directed the world's attention to a sadly overlooked tragedy, Iris Chang. This video is dedicated to the memory of Iris Chang and the victims of the rape of Nanking. Please like and subscribe so that we may bring you other topics deserving your attention. Also, you can watch The Rape of Nanking 1998 on Amazon, the story of Iris Chang's history of the event.